Welcome to the Writing Westward podcast. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. Today we speak with Professor Maurice Crandall about his new book, These People Have Always Been a Republic, Indigenous Electorates in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, 1598 to 1912. Let me take a quick moment to explain a bit about the podcast and who produces it. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. For better or worse, it's a one-man operation with me, Brendan Rensink, playing role of host, producer, sound engineer, and everything else. I'm Associate Director of the Redd Center and an Associate Professor of History at BYU, neither of which roles trained me for the current task. But I do have a lot of fun doing this because I'm passionate about better understanding the North American West, the region I have called home for most of my life. In each Writing Westward episode, I have a conversation with writers of the region. Academics, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, anyone authoring anything about the West. My goal is that these conversations will spark listeners' curiosity to dig in a bit more themselves and think differently about the peoples, histories, environments, ideas, and identities that make up the North American West, or that we ascribe to the region. Please leave reviews or comments on whatever platform you are listening and let me know if we're succeeding. For updates or communication, please follow Writing Westward on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on Twitter at Writing West. You can find all episodes on our website, writingwestward.org, or listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or most all major podcast distribution platforms, apps, and services. To learn more about the BYU Redd Center, stay tuned, and at the end of the episode, I'll offer some additional information about our projects, programming, live-streamed lectures, funding opportunities for research, and events. Find the center at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's R-E-D-D Center. For more regular updates, you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at BYU Redd Center. Now, let me tell you a little bit about today's guest. Maurice Crandall is a member of the Yavapai Apache Nation in Arizona and an assistant professor of Native American Studies at Dartmouth College. His new book, These People Have Always Been a Republic, Indigenous Electorates in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, 1598 to 1912, was published in 2019 by the University of North Carolina Press in their outstanding David J. Weber series in New Borderlands History. Professor Crandall traces and compares the histories of Pueblos, Hopis, Tohono-O'odhams, and Yakis in their interactions with Spanish, Mexican, and American systems of governance and voting. Crandall demonstrates how these groups adapted imposed political systems and hybridized them with their own, actively participating in outside systems of government as a means of preserving community, tradition, and sovereignty at home. This is complex history, and it shows oscillating highs and lows of native rights and power across successive colonial and settler colonial regimes. He argues that this history can and should inform modern native peoples in their continued fight for sovereignty. For non-native readers and listeners, especially those of us in the West, Crandall's work reveals complex inner workings of native societies that are too often ignored or outright disrespected by outsiders. In a region that regularly talks in overly worn stereotypes and mythologies, this work reminds us that there is more going on in Native histories and current communities than most recognize. Professor Maurice Crandall, welcome to Writing Westward.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I hope that you are weathering the pandemic well, quarantined in Vermont. Are things starting to warm up there for you this spring?
It's good right now. It's nice. Spring is sort of non-existent in northern New England. We sort of go from winter to summer generally. So we had snow in May, and then boom, it was 90 degrees. Although we've had some fluctuating temperatures, but spring, like an extended nice seasons, is really short here. You also have mud season. You heard of mud season? Do you know mud season?
No.
That's when everything melts, all the snow melts, and then, it's mostly dirt roads. I live on a dirt road, so everything just turns to quagmire, and you get, if it's a good mud season, it'll be a few weeks of just terrible, muddy, rutty roads. But this mud season was pretty much non-existent because we weren't going anywhere. So one of the advantages of the pandemic is that we missed mud season, more or less, which was good. That was nice.
Well, For our conversation today, we'll definitely be in drier climes, focusing on the Southwest.
Hmm.
I was happy to be able to work through your book and happy to share it with our listeners. It's an election year, and I think people have voting and elections on the mind. And your book takes a very unique take on that and shares with us some unique histories about not just voting and suffrage, but about political activity and governance among
Hmm.
Indigenous peoples, which is, I think, something that will be great for people to think about, and something I think that will be really important for Indigenous peoples to think about and to reflect on their own tribal communities' histories and traditions with voting and government.
Sure, absolutely.
Your work pushes against some historical narratives that I want to open with, specifically the idea that with Native American rights, be it voting rights or other rights in the American Southwest, you push against this idea that there's this clean progression with colonial Spanish or Mexican interactions preparing the way for expanded rights in the United States, then culminate in citizenship in 1921, and then
24.
voting 1924,
Yeah.
and then voting thereafter. But you show that prior to the U.S. era, Native communities had undergone centuries of adapting to political systems, engaging in self-governance, integrating Spanish and Mexican systems of voting and government into their own, being active political agents, including voting, and that they had undergone various processes before the United States shows up. So, in the broadest terms, why do you think that presenting this less linear, progressive narrative is so important as background for understanding Native experiences in the Southwest?
I mean, there are a few reasons. One is I don't know necessarily that people who are from the Southwest or Indigenous people from the Southwest tend to forget that there's a very long colonial history. I think that that's very present in the minds of indigenous peoples from that region, particularly those I write about. But I think more broadly, sometimes when history is viewed as sort of starting with the U.S.-Mexico War in that region, um, the advent of Anglo-American colonialism, that indigenous interactions with colonial powers um, can be portrayed as sort of starting there. That what comes before is just sort of an introduction or a prologue. But the important things happen after 1846. That political activity, civil rights, all this ramps up within the American framework. And so I'm very deliberately pushing back against that idea. And I think even more broadly speaking, the idea that a settler government like the United States has been some sort of benign or benevolent government that grants rights. I mean, it's not a reality. Certainly for the people in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, it's not a historical reality. The United States is not a nation that comes in and sort of organizes chaos and then grants rights. And I think that that can be a view that too many people take. And that's not to say that what came before was good or organized or wonderful. It's all a mess. What happened under colonial Spain and then during the Mexican period of independence, all of it was bad and traumatic and terrible for indigenous peoples. Um, and then what happened with the United States was just as bad and terrible and traumatic, and maybe more so even. But yeah, the idea that history is progressive, that the histories of civil rights for people of color can be explained away as taking steps and moving forward and upward is just it's a false narrative and it's harmful.
Why do you think it's dangerous or harmful, specifically for Native communities and Native peoples?
Well, for one thing, um, those types of narratives lend themselves to people and let's say politicians who think that our work is finished, right? We've worked our way to this point. The work we needed to do is done. I mean, that's the kind of thinking that's behind policies like termination.
We've climbed the mountain. We've made it to the
We
top, and
have,
we're good to go.
yeah. And look at these tribal nations. They take Menominees. They have a successful lumber mill. They have the land and timber resources that could sustain them. The work has led up to this point. They're ready for that relationship to be terminated. Let's end it. And so, for one, I think that that's dangerous. And any type of political maneuvering and rhetoric that frames things in that way as progressive and as you know, we've reached this point, and so now it's time to cut the ties, treaty obligations, the trust responsibility, all of that. I think that it's dangerous because of that, and I think that we're seeing that right now with Black Lives Matter. I mean, how many people who oppose this movement say, well, you know, why do we need this? We have civil rights, we have the laws, and the argument that people say, you know, laws don't change people. You need to change people's hearts. And it's like, no, because when systems and institutions infringe on people and their liberty and equality, then it's not a matter of people's hearts. It's systemic. So yeah, I think that overall there's a danger in framing things that way, because we should never be to the point where we think like, oh, our work is done. On the other side, even with Indigenous nations, with my nation, to think we're there, right? The ultimate goal would be Indigenous liberation and true sovereignty, and we're not there. And I think that if anybody gets to that point and says, yeah, we're there, our work is done, and people now who maybe even say, you know, we are Indigenous nations, we're sovereign nations, we have a nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government, to think that that all is accomplished is dangerous. So I just think that viewing history that way, it's simplistic. It can endanger people and communities, and we need to be much more vigilant and always see history as ebbs and flows, as ups and downs, and as there always needing to be much more work to be done.
Well, I think one thing we get from this that I really appreciate is that, for me, I've always thought that the messier the history is, the more complicated it is, the more challenging it is. Even though it may make us uncomfortable or be challenging, it in the end is more empowering, especially for the history of, you know, the specific groups that are being talked about. And I find that in your book, by revealing all of the ebbs and flows through the Spanish, Mexican, and then U.S. periods that these native nations went through, we see examples of not just native agency, but of real complicated, complex native decision-making by individuals and by communities. And some of it is 300, 400 years old, but it shows that native peoples having civil rights or being really astute political actors is not just a 20th century phenomenon. You know, it didn't just start with the red progressives, you know, in the early 20th century. You had 300 years ago native communities coming together and politicking and strategizing and
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that the historiography is that body of work that demonstrates this is growing, particularly among, you know, like early Americanists who are showing the petition and how much Native nations, both individually and collectively, have used the petition. I had some of my students this term read petitions by Haudenosaunee peoples in upstate New York in particular, who were opposing removal. I mean, this is during the removal era, and they were using a variety of languages in those petitions and the way that they referred to officials and the president and members of Congress in their petitions, appeals to both civilization and Christianity, but then also using language that put them on an equal footing with American officials. And so I think that, we need to see political communities as exercising sovereignty over the course of hundreds of years from the earliest days. It's not like Native people had to learn systems. I mean, they had to become familiarized with systems of governance and colonial institutions, but it's not like the learning started there. I mean, these were already politically astute communities. This is just overlaying another system that then has to be negotiated and navigated, but always within the framework of what was already there, that these people have always been a republic. They've always had a government, right? They've always been doing this. This is just a newcomer, a colonial nation state comes in, okay, we have to deal with this, but we've already been doing this in our communities. We already know about governance. We already know about negotiation. And so we're going to have to do what works, and we're going to have to figure out what works. And some of it's going to be indigenous, but some of it is going to be adaptation. But that's what this is all about.
Yeah, I hope that listeners find this empowering as well as they think about, their own histories or communities or whatever it is that they're working on. Sometimes we view new modern problems that we're facing and we kind of tell ourselves that, well, now we need to finally rise up and come up with solutions. But we can look back and whatever our history is and find in our community's histories with our ancestors that they rose up and found solutions to what often were very similar problems, perhaps in older trappings and without certain modern contexts, but we can draw from their lessons. That's why we study history. This isn't rocket science, right?
No,
that's
absolutely.
why we study history. Well, let's you talk about 4 groups in your book, and you work through these chronologically in the book, and I'd like to take them in a different order and take them by group. These are Pueblos in New Mexico, and what becomes New Mexico, Hopis in northern Arizona, Tohono O'odhams along what becomes the U.S.-Mexico border, and Yakis in Sonora and Arizona. And I'd like to start with the Pueblos, and that may be the group that we spend the most time with.
Yeah.
In your book, it is the group that I think does have the most page dedicated to them, but it's the group that we by far have the most records for, and goes through some of the most robust and complicated processes, and it's useful to, throughout your book, you bounce the other examples kind of all off the Pueblo example.
Sure.
Explain to us, and this is one thing that I found really fascinating, and I think this will kind of serve as kind of a good example of the complicated nature of Native governance in some of these early colonial interactions. Can you walk us through in the briefest terms, which may be difficult, so post-Spanish colonial contact, New Mexico Pueblos start integrating Spanish forms of governance with their own. And could you explain to us the election process that they have in this early colonial era? You have a tripartite government with 14 officials, and in my understanding, and I don't want to try to grill you on the specifics here, but
sure.
The first part you had some Spanish, you had a governor, 2 lieutenants, and a sheriff. The second part of the government was a war chief, assistant war chief, and then 4 or 5 officials guarding traditional knowledge. And then you had another group with church officials.
Sure.
This is a complex system. But walk us through then
Try to simplify this a little bit.
How do they then run elections? And it happens on specific days. There's specific processes. Run us through this to give listeners a flavor for how complicated this system was.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that needs to be mentioned is when we say the word Pueblo Indians, Pueblo nations, we're talking about what was once scores of nations, that when Spaniards came to New Mexico, that there were many, many, many Pueblo nations that ranged from, northern Tiwas in Taos and Picaris down to Salinas Pueblos and in southern New Mexico. So it's a wide range of people.
And they speak mutually unintelligible languages. It's a complex group.
It is, and so we're talking about a large group of indigenous nations, and so it's difficult. Part of the reason that they have the largest page count is because we're talking about the most nations when we're talking about pueblos, and so that's part of the reason. So the system of government that Spain implements all over their colonial realm, the places that they, conquer forcefully and subdue. It takes a different form in each setting, but it's sort of, there are similarities throughout. And much of it depended on where, the nations that they're encountering, and also the orders of friars that are there administering these missions, because these are mission communities. So there's always this, on the Spanish side, this church-state duality, and frequently in competition, each side in competition with the other. But what you have is,
I think Taos Pueblo was kind of the system that I was referring to, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And so if you can walk us through that, does it differ dramatically from some of the other pueblos?
No, it wouldn't differ significantly.
So it's somewhat
it's going to be
representative?
similar.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going to be similar in the pueblos. What you have is a Spanish, governor will come to the community. So if we're talking about Vargas, when he comes to New Mexico in 1598, he goes to the pueblos and he makes them perform this act of submission. Of course, there's this misunderstanding, obviously, on the part of the pueblos or how they understand this interaction to take place and its meanings. They certainly aren't saying, we submit 100% to the two lords, Jesus Christ and the Spanish king. But anyway, Spaniards don't want to deal with large groups of indigenous leaders who do things by consensus, who talk sometimes for days until everybody is in agreement and they can reach this consensus in important decisions. They want a handful of identifiable individuals with whom that they can interact and that will make decisions for that community and be the point people for those interactions. And so it's loosely based on the Spanish town model, where you have a governor, or sometimes it's an alcalde, depending on the group and the setting. But in New Mexico, it's a governor, sometimes referred to as a gobernadorcillo, like a little governor. Obviously, it's a pejorative for an indigenous governor not being seen as important as a Spanish governor. So you have the governor, and then his lieutenant, or a few lieutenants, and then you have war chiefs and other officials, and then you have church officers who would see to church attendance in the community. They could compel and use compulsory means to make indigenous community members go to mass and go to different church functions. You have a sheriff that is to oversee law and order in the community, and the governor is often vested with the power to punish minor crimes. Typically, it's the priest who will oversee major crimes, or it'll go to an actual Spanish court. But the priests were not adverse to flogging individuals. I mean, they did this frequently in communities. The election itself also could depend on the place. In most of the pueblos, what you had was an election that conformed more to indigenous ways of leadership and of selecting leaders. So in the Taos Pueblos, frequently where there's the split between summer and winter in those communities. So you have a summer chief and a winter chief. Yeah, there are these moieties there, and they're rotating in the sense that one will begin the selecting each year. And so as Alfonso Ortiz explained in Tewa World, the year the summer chief starts and says, this is my choice for governor. And then the winter chief says, that's good, this is mine for lieutenant governor. And then they go back and forth till they've chosen all the officers. And roughly you have the outline of who the officers will be for the coming year. Then those are taken to society leaders, Kiva leaders, and
And they debate then, right?
And they will, but usually it's done through consensus, unless somebody knows a compelling reason why somebody shouldn't be in a leadership position. But generally, there will be agreement, and they have to be wise in their choices. Obviously, these individuals will be interacting with Spaniards frequently. They will need to go to Santa Fe or even all the way to Mexico City if there's a very pressing issue that needs an audience with, with the viceroy or someone of that sort.
I mean, they need
Um,
good governance. Their
abs-
survival and prosperity depends on it.
yeah. Generally speaking, although people are removed from office and you have petitions from Pueblo communities that, the guy who's the governor is not doing a good job, is doing a bad job, and they want him out of there, or he's abusing his power.
Hmm. See, like up to here, this sounds not too foreign, right? You have some kind of ideas of representative government, already chosen officials choosing other officials.
Well,
Uh,
the already chosen officials who are doing the choosing, though, they're not. Those are religious leaders in the community. They
the
are,
society heads, yeah.
yeah. These are people who have religious offices and ceremonial functions, and they're not part of the Spanish system
So
generally.
here's where we see this kind of hybridity already of the two systems
Absolutely,
overlapping.
absolutely, and the two forms. So in Pueblo society, as Pueblo peoples have said to me on numerous occasions, we are a theocracy. This is theocratic government. So the society leaders and the cacique, the summer winter chief, all of these individuals, they are religious leaders. I mean, their primary functions are religious because in the Pueblo world, everything has to be overseen and done through a cycle of ceremonies and prayers and offerings, and all of this needs to be done to ensure harmony in the world, to ensure a proper harvest, and that the community will have what it needs and the protection that it needs. And so those leaders that are overseeing this election are religious
Hmm.
leaders. They are religious leaders. The secular leadership that's chosen, the Spanish officials are secular officials. They don't have religious functions, generally speaking. They're there to deal with Spaniards in
Mm-hmm.
matters that pertain to the Pueblo land, to Pueblo rights, disputes with outsiders or with neighbors who are moving onto Pueblo lands and whatnot. But it's understood that they are elected, and chosen, and usually just for a year. But it's understood that the real power in the community rests with the traditional leadership. That's where the power truly is. And that's not to say that these officers who are chosen under the Spanish system that's imposed aren't important. They are important because they're going to go to court. They're going to lobby officials. They're going to send petitions. They're going to argue for their people and their communities. But they are not overseeing the day-to-day ceremonial obligations of the community that ensure harmony, that
So is
ensure
their role
life.
more external facing in a way?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So then
Absolutely.
these nominated officials are the governor takes them and presents their name to all of the outgoing officials.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
and this is all on December 31st. And then on January 1st, the outgoing officials go and kind of kidnap all of the new nominees, and they go through this kind of process of the nominees like feigning humility and like, oh no, no, I surely couldn't,
Hmm.
do this, and they go through kind of
Yeah.
a very kind of uh, a prescribed set of kind of cultural steps, right? Of
I think to some extent, yes. I mean, they're like you say, the outgoing officers from the previous year are told by the society heads and the religious leaders from the community who have done the actual electing. They're told who their replacements are, and leading up to this, all is kept very under wraps. I mean, they're very secretive because historically, to be an officer, to be a governor or a lieutenant governor, basically it's a year of service to your community, but it's done without pay generally, and you're going to be away for long periods. You'll be away from your family. Um, you won't be able to spend as much time in your field, growing the food necessary. I mean, it's a huge obligation and responsibility. And so when the new officers who have been selected and chosen for office are notified, I think that people really are saying why they can't do it, because what you're in for, and maybe you think, oh gosh, I don't know if I can do this, right?
So they're not just feigning humility; they sometimes
I
actually
think,
don't.
oh yeah, absolutely. And there are cases, and I've been told by Pueblo friends of times when people were out of town intentionally at the end of the year that in one, guy I worked with who was from Acoma, and he said that one of the officers who had been selected was out of town, and the community sent somebody after him, and they drove to wherever he was and picked him up and brought him back and said, you're an officer now and you need to do this for the community. And so I think that, yes, there is some humility that you need to display, because in Indigenous society, it's not good to say, oh yes, you've chosen me, that's right, I'm great, I'm the one for this job, because that's frowned upon in a more collective type of Indigenous community where that type of kind of prideful showing is totally frowned upon. So yes, you have to say, oh, I don't know if I can do this. But then I think that there are real concerns by those who are selected that, gosh, do I have the time, the resources? Will my family be okay? All these things are sincere. But once that's done, and once the people have been told, as Alfonso Ortiz said, it's sort of like all resistance is futile. It's almost like the Borg, right? Resistance is futile in the end, for the most part. Although there is a way, if somebody is truly seen unfit for office, or in some, in rare cases where somebody can truly make a compelling argument as to why they can't do it, maybe there's something that people aren't aware of, then it can happen that somebody who has been chosen for office and elected through that Indigenous electoral process won't then be in office. But usually it's seen as your responsibility, your obligation to the community. You've been asked by the leadership and those leaders in your community, the religious leaders, to do something, and so you agree to do it because that's your responsibility as a community member.
So after all this, there's then some ceremonies with the governor, transfers of authority.
Right.
They get a blessing from the priests.
Sure.
Yeah.
There's both religious ceremonies with the traditional leadership, who, give them talks and say, look, you're important for our community and you need to do your job well. You need to see to it that our lands are protected, that our way of life, that our very existence, which depends on all this, is protected and safe. And then there's the local priest at the mission who will sort of give them a similar talk and give some sort of a prayer over them. And then traditionally the leaders will travel to the provincial seat of power, which in New Mexico is Santa Fe. So they go to Santa Fe, and the governor there or his representative then, so there's this kind of inauguration, if you will, where, all of the necessary stamps of approval have been made from the religious leaders of the community, which is the most important to the Pueblo. The actual traditional leadership has given their stamp of approval, then the priest there, and then the governor of New Mexico. So they have sanction from all these different areas, and they're seen as the legitimate secular civil leaders in their community for the coming year.
What I think is interesting about this is not a straight Spanish system. Spain here was allowing Pueblos to really do a lot of things their own way. And you write about how the Spanish goals very much, both short and long term, were kind of three parts: the reduction of native peoples, their conversion to Catholicism, and then this idea of self-government. But the reason for all that, the end goal, is that Spain was viewing native peoples as future citizens and future tax revenues. Mm-hmm. They wanted to turn these lands and these peoples into taxable citizens.
Right.
And one way to do that is to allow for some flexibility with them to make these hybrid systems. And I'm interested then, if we can kind of move then into the Mexican era, when Mexico comes in, there's some of these high ideals of native independence and equality and opportunity. It's going to be this bright new future, but and I'm curious if you see some parallels here with the termination era in the United States, as Mexico is envisioning equality for its native peoples in treating them as quote unquote normal citizens and not as Indian republics as Spain had.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Often what that meant in practice was encroachment on native lands and resources and the reduction of protections for native peoples and lands and resources. So this isn't like the end game of what Spain was doing of turning them into normal citizens. I'm not saying this is a clean progression, but do you see this equality rhetoric that comes then in the Mexican era as analogous to later what happens with termination in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are some similarities, and you'll see that play out in Pueblo communities, in the other groups that we talk about. I mean, with Yakis in particular, this idea of, so I mean, the way that the missions were supposed to progress was, a fairly quick secularization, that they wouldn't be run by orders of friars anymore. You wouldn't have Jesuits or Franciscans, but they would have a secular priest there, and that they would be parishes, which then, would pay an actual tithe, and then they would be Spanish subject citizens and pay taxes to the crown. But then the reality was that didn't take place. That didn't happen. I mean, these remained communities that were run through Franciscans. The hold that the orders had diminished significantly during the latter part of the Spanish period in New Mexico and elsewhere. I mean, just the power that the orders of friars had diminished for a variety of reasons. And then you have the Bourbon reforms, and a lot happens. But in the Mexican era, the ideals of equality, the Plan de Igualdad, and that the distinctions between indigenous peoples and non-indigenous were dropped, that the language itself is changed, and how indigenous people are referred to in documents changes. And yes, these ideals are a way to get rid of indigenous communities as distinctive communities. It's a way to, get rid of any way of referring to them that makes reference to their indigeneity, to their status as Indian republics, as they had been under Spain, with the end goal of political incorporation, increasing the tax body, dropping any special protections, or like under Spain at various times, there was a protector de indios, a person who was selected to represent indigenous peoples in court cases and sort of be their protector. And some individuals did that fairly well, others not so well. But yeah, I mean, it's similar to what goes on later in the United States, and not even just with termination, but with how the United States deals with Pueblo peoples during the territorial period. I mean, they're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to say, look, you all are too advanced to be Indians anymore, right? So we don't even want to call you that because you're not like other Indians. Well, no Indians are like other Indians. We are all indigenous nations. We're all completely different from each other and have our own distinct cultures and traditions and forms of governance and all of this. So that whole argument was pretty stupid. But the goal is always a form of political incorporation that results in erasure, in disappearance. You want indigenous people to just sort of fade away into the larger body politic, into the mainstream, so that they're gone. And this is colonialism, right? This is settler colonialism is aimed at erasure. And so, of course, these communities are resilient and resist and keep their traditions and stay solvent and strong. But all three of the colonial powers, I mean, their end goal is to get rid of indigenous people. Let's be honest. That's what they want to do.
Well, at the end of the Mexican era, when we talk about citizenship, I think view that on its face largely as a real positive thing. We're like, oh, yeah, like how could they not have been granted citizenship? It's great that they were, right? So they come out of the Mexican era as citizens. But then how does
nominal
yes,
citizens
on paper.
Yeah. Because most things in Pueblo communities and indigenous communities in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands continue as they had before.
Yeah. How does citizenship then play out in the American period then? Because this becomes very complicated for Pueblo peoples. And maybe we can move through this really quick so we can get to some of the other groups. Sure. But again, we think, how wrong is it that they weren't considered regular citizens of the United States until 1924? But in the Pueblo example, we actually see that with becoming a citizen had a dark side and had that there were things you gained and lost. So you walk us through that the Pueblo example a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, granted citizenship or the possibility for citizenship, U.S. citizenship, to anyone who had been a Mexican citizen. And since Pueblos had been declared citizens of Mexico, the Republic, then that meant they could become U.S. citizens. And so the United States, early on, and actually for several decades after the late 1840s, there are questions of the status of Pueblo peoples. Are they citizens? The U.S. officials are obsessed with levels of civilization. I mean, this is the Indian Bureau is frequently classifying people. They wear citizen dress. They do these things, so they're higher on the scale than these people. They're always comparing because of this, ideas of social evolution that happen. But the Pueblos are seen as, yes, potentially citizens, but also maybe not quite there yet. And U.S. officials are sort of perplexed. There's a camp that wants to declare them all just, yes, the Pueblos are citizens of the United States, while at the same time denying the right to vote and suffrage and what we would deem, just kind of fundamental civil rights.
They want to have it both ways. They want them to be taxable citizens with no land protections, but they shouldn't be able to vote.
Exactly. And then there's another camp which says, no, they need to be under the protection in quotes, of the Indian Bureau and have protections for their land in trust, that type of idea. And so, this dispute plays out, and the Pueblos eventually, for their part, side with the Indian Bureau because it offers the best protections of their communities that foster more sovereignty and independence. Because yes, if they're declared citizens of the United States, then their lands are not protected under federal law, the Non-Intercourse Acts that would provide protection from outsiders and from selling land. And so citizenship would be disastrous for the Pueblos, and many of them recognize that. And on top of that, they say, the fundamental argument that they ultimately make is we already have a government. We already have a form. We went through this process twice already with Spain and Mexico. Here we are, a new colonizer has arrived. We've gone through this before. We have systems in place that are robust, that have protected our land base and our people, not, imperfectly, obviously, over time. And these systems, again, are not without their faults and need to be critiqued as well, because they're male dominated, they've sustained patriarchy and patriarchal ideas and systems, and that's not good, and not really the Pueblo way. But anyway, ultimately they say, look, we already have a form of government. We already have elections. We already have officers. We take care of our communities. We do all of these things. We see to judicial matters and law and order and all of it. We already do all of this, and U.S. citizenship will not change that. What it will do is make our lands more susceptible to encroachment, sale, theft, outright theft by non-Indigenous people. And so there's a rejection of citizenship and of voting specifically, because voting is sort of the thing that's most associated with citizenship. And so Pueblo peoples during the territorial period up through the early 1900s, there are pockets of Pueblo peoples that go to the polls and that vote, but generally speaking, they don't do it. They stay away, with the understanding of, look, we just want to be sovereign communities. We want to see to our own affairs, and being involved in political matters of the United States or the territory of New Mexico more broadly will not help us and potentially harms us more.
Well, for the other three groups you talk about, Hopis, Yakis, and Tono Othams, in the broadest terms, and again, this is from enormous portions of your book, and I'm not going to do it any justice here, but in the most generalized terms, Hopi peoples more reject and do not incorporate all of these things in Spain, Mexican, and early U.S. territorial era.
Absolutely.
Sweeping generalization. Tono Othams do incorporate things and have some hybrid systems, but the system is never as well developed or is consistently sustained, and it's never quite as robust as with the Pueblos. And then the Yakis are kind of on the other extreme. So you kind of lay these out as in kind of on a scale. The Yakis really aggressively incorporate Spanish systems and build a robust hybrid system and robust political measures in Sonora. And one thing that I found so interesting about this is that, there's somewhat of a paradox, especially with the Yakis, in that their incorporation of Spanish systems, their conversion and Spanish systems of government they incorporated, they then use that to strengthen their power against Spain and against the colonial power. And I talk about it a little bit in my book. Rafe Folsom talks about it in his book, Yakis and Empire. We have these, over centuries, repeated Yaqui revolts and rebellions and warfare against Spain and against Mexico. But often the triggering events were when Spain or Mexico came in and tried to monkey around with Yaqui governance. Governance, which was a hybrid Spanish Yaqui system, but that they then had taken over, they owned it, they used it for their own power, and when Spain then tried to come in and monkey with it, that's when Yaquis stand up and revolt.
Sure. And Folsom, even his argument of let's say like the Yaqui revolt in the 1730s and 40s, that they're not revolting to get rid of a Spanish system. They actually want to dictate the terms of their own participation. In a Spanish and capitalist system. We want to work at mines. We want to work where we want. We want to be where we want. We want mobility. We want economic freedoms. And again, and the argument that I make, a large part of it is don't mess with our government. Stop meddling in our elections. Stop deposing our officers. Stop Jesuits, controlling elections and sort of forcing their own candidates who are sort of indigenous yes men in many cases, sort of favor the Jesuit side, let's say. That's often problematic. And there's some, we could say there's some irony in that, of course, that they're fighting for a system that is a hybridized indigenous but also Spanish system, right? It's a combination of these things.
It's a big intervention, though, that you and Folsom and others make to reframe this, because it reframes Yaqui or even other indigenous resistance, which Spain would like to characterize as they're trying to reject, rejecting the colonial power, and that's not exactly what was happening. They were saying they were trying to dictate their participation in that colonial system.
Absolutely. And just kind of even to broader themes of thinking about indigenous communities as being sort of like timeless, and that traditions persist and are sort of unchanging, which is also, I think, a dangerous way to view indigenous communities. They are incorporative. They use what works. They take what they like. And in my community, I see this as well. There are things that there are innovations that maybe come from outside, but those that come from within, and you take all of these things and they can be used together with an indigenous way of being and thinking always at the core of everything. I mean, the Yaqui way of being, of living, the Yaqui life ways are always at the core. But absolutely, they are certainly by the 1700s into the 18th century and after, are an interesting mix. I mean, and incredibly complex. I mean, all of these different societies within the community and ingenious ways of even taking Catholic religion and indigenizing it and making it Yaqui. That Jesus Christ walked along the Yaqui River. I mean, when I was down there a couple summers ago, there was a place where there's a footprint on a rock along the Yaqui River in one of the villages, and our Yaqui friends were showing us this place, and they're like, yeah, that's the footprint where Jesus walked on this river, and that the Bethlehem in the Bible that's mentioned becomes Belem, the Yaqui village, and that these things take place within Yaqui communities, which is an ingenious way of, taking the colonizers' tools and totally flipping them on their head and indigenizing them, making them your own.
Let's talk about Arizona and New Mexico a little bit, and how native citizenship and voting plays out during the territorial and then into that early state period, which is where you end your book. How do these debates how do the debates over Pueblos and Hopis, Tono Othams, and others, in Arizona and New Mexico play out in this latter period, bringing us up to citizenship in 1924? But actually, Arizona and New Mexico don't grant full native suffrage until the 1940s, I think.
Late 1940s.
So how do these kind of latter periods play out then for these other groups?
So in New Mexico with Pueblo Peoples, you have resistance to citizenship, and during the first decades into the 1920s of the 20th century, you have the emergence of, and this isn't really in my book, I mean, I mentioned him a few times, but Pablo Abeda becomes a very vocal spokesman for Pueblo Peoples. He's an Isleta Pueblo man who had positions there, but they're very much opposed to citizenship because they don't want a political status sort of placed upon them, right? They want it to be of their own choosing. And Pablo Beta famously says, like, I hope I'm dead and buried before my people ever vote, before they go to the polls. And that's not to say that some individuals or groups of individuals didn't go to elections and vote. They did. There are examples here and there, but largely speaking, indigenous peoples are opposed to the vote. You have a turn after the World Wars, where more indigenous Arizonans and New Mexicans both are pursuing civil rights, the franchise in particular. And I think that there are a variety of reasons for that. There's sort of a larger exposure to the world, going overseas, and a large group of veterans who come home and who see their communities, and within a broader framework of talking about civil rights and sort of being second-class citizens, they start to articulate arguments that are more in line with civil rights arguments, right? And that indigenous people deserve the vote. But previous to that time, by indigenous peoples, largely there is, at the very least, disinterest in voting or outright rejection. And because why? Well, these communities, the most important thing as sovereign nations, the most important things are national affairs, their own affairs within their communities, and they continue to be nations, to act like nations, and the most important things are those that affect their own communities. And when they need redress, well, then delegations go to Washington, D.C. and talk to the president, or they send letters to officials, or they meet with Indian agents and governors of territories. But by and large, there is no big move by indigenous communities to secure the vote. That doesn't happen. And while at the same time, in both New Mexico and Arizona, there are efforts to sometimes enfranchise Native communities, or not enfranchise, but to have them declared citizens, like we said, so that then their land is open and white settlers can be enriched from those lands, or not even always white settlers, sometimes Latino settlers or Hispano settlers. But then you have the development at the same time of laws that are based on race, territorial laws in Arizona that bar non-white people from the franchise.
Mexico doesn't have that wording.
No,
right? That's
well,
unique
in
to
New
Arizona.
Mexico, yeah, in the Herald Code. In New Mexico, it's largely based on Indians not taxed. So the New Mexico Territorial Constitution, which says and then the state constitution, it refers to people not taxed, Indians not taxed, not having the franchise.
Mm-hmm.
And then in Arizona, indigenous people are barred from voting through a wardship status. So being under the quote unquote wardship or supervision of the Indian Bureau barred indigenous people from voting in Arizona. But the statute itself, as it was written, referred to people of not sound mind and institutionalized, so imprisoned or institutionalized people, or wards of the government in that sense. And so indigenous people are classed with, the mentally insane or institutionalized. And it's, those laws are important, but at the same time, like I said, there's no rush by indigenous people to secure the franchise. And so what those laws do is just really enshrine racism towards indigenous people. And it's not until, again, the post-war years, the latter part of the 1940s, with returning veterans who are kind of running, who are pushing for voting rights, and you see a different development there. But the legacy of all this continues, and you have in indigenous communities in New Mexico and Arizona and elsewhere. I think you'd find this trend nationwide, a real suspicion of American forms of democracy, and often low voter turnouts. And so you have these rock the vote initiatives every election cycle in indigenous communities in particular. And I think that you have a lot of indigenous people who say, I don't want to vote. Like, voting isn't important to me because we are indigenous nations, and we need to act like indigenous nations and not try to be part of the settler state. Like, what does it have to give to us? The idea that a state grants rights. We are sovereign nations with inherent rights. We don't need any of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's kind of this, to the level in which certain Native peoples were engaged with the United States, right? Perhaps by being a veteran, or perhaps living off reservation. The incentives or the interest in voting maybe sometimes increases, but again, it's often on their initiative. We have this narrative that the United States comes and grants the right to vote, right, bestows it upon Native peoples, but often in practice it was not until Native peoples themselves decided that yes, this time it is in our best interest to engage with the settler state by voting in, American elections. But
and it still remains controversial.
Yeah,
and it's still controversial in those communities, even in the late 1940s, when Miguel Trujillo in New Mexico, who's a Marine Corps veteran. He didn't see like active battle combat, but he was a veteran during the war and had a college education, was a BIA teacher. Starts pressing for voting rights. There was not consensus in Pueblo communities of like, yeah, we need to do this. There was still, discussion over that, and I think continued discussion to this day in many indigenous communities, the people who say, engagement with a settler colonial nation like the United States ultimately doesn't benefit us. We shouldn't be focusing our attention on that and engaging with those systems. We should be engaged in direct action aimed at indigenous liberation. And you see that play out in the 20th and 21st century, and with organizations like the National Congress of American Indians, which is very much aimed at lobbying and political, engaging with the United States government and political action in the form of lobbying. And then the National Indian Youth Council, the NIYC, which is like, no, we're going to take direct action. And those groups are kind of in dispute with each other. And, the National Congress of American Indians, for a time, they say Indians don't protest. We don't do that. That's their mantra. And the National Indian Youth Council, in a response, because it's youth led and it's young people, they start calling them the National Congress of Aged Indians. So these things, they're still
these tensions
relevant
that are here today, like are the same that were here in the 19-teens and that's what's fascinating.
And the 19th century and the 18th century, and yes, right? To what level do you engage with a colonial state for your quote unquote protections or rights? How far will that take you? And those are the questions that these groups that I work on are asking. What does engagement, what does voting, what does political participation in the territory of New Mexico or in Mexican New Mexico or the province of Sonora, what does political participation and engagement with these colonial forms accomplish? What will it get us? How will it help us? And the answers aren't always the same. And you'll see it plays out differently in each period and in each setting. But those are ultimately the questions. And I think the answer that the answer that I give in my book is not all that much in the end. That the most important thing is sovereignty. It's being indigenous nations, being the nations that we are. And I see that in my own community as well. We have these discussions and what good does it do us to interact with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, continually? Has it helped us in the end, or should we start acting more like a sovereign nation? Yes, my thought is yes, we should. We should be the sovereign nations that we are.
So if you had the stage and you had the ear of every Native community in the United States and all their tribal councils, and they had all just read your book. Is this what you would impart to them, saying, learn from this history of how these Native nations negotiated all these things, but in the end, think about how to act in the best interest of being a sovereign Native community. Engage when it benefits us. Focus on internal matters when it benefits us, and kind of continue this tradition of adaptability and flexibility and active, not just reactive, but active decision-making and engagement for political matters, internal, external.
Absolutely. I think all those things are important. The adaptability, the learning from, what has worked and what hasn't worked, and trying to kind of forecast future interactions with colonial nation states, but always keeping in mind a strong sense of indigenous nationalism. That we are nations, and that the thing that we need to protect more than anything else is our land, our culture, our way of life, and our nationhood.
Well, I really enjoyed this book. It's a region and an era that and a number of topics that I thought I had a good handle on, and it turns out I didn't. And I learned a lot. I want to give you the opportunity, if you'd like, to tell us about any new things that you're working on. I know some authors don't want to get scoops. They keep some things close to the chest. But is there anything new in the pipeline that you're excited about that we should be looking for?
I have a few things coming out, that are in press. One is a a contribution to a Journal of Arizona History issue that's coming out in the fall on sort of the state of the field of Arizona history, and I'm looking at my own community and particularly Yavapai history and issues with Yavapai historiography and representation, and why, as I argue, an extremely important Indigenous group within the landscape of Arizona's Indigenous community, we sort of are often absent, and that story is not there. So that's one thing that I'm working on. Another chapter in a book that will be published at some point on Indigenous urbanism, looking at particularly my community and how it interacted with urbanization and industrialization in the progressive era.
Just so the Clement Center volume.
Yeah. I think I'm turning more towards my own community for sure. I mean, I'll be doing work with the Yavapai Apache Nation, more on topics related to, and a variety of things. I mean, I'm trying to help secure a language grant for Yavapai language, working with a linguist out of California and trying to work with our tribe's culture department and with language initiatives. And then my next book will be on my community with an interest specifically on scouts, so Apache and Yavapai scouts, Western Apache and Yavapai scouts who, in large numbers were part of the so-called Apache Wars in the 1870s and 80s, but looking more at what happened to these individuals and their families after the wars are over. Like, how do they contribute to their communities, especially in a period when we think of the nadir of Indigenous North America is around 1900, right? The census numbers are the lowest and they start to rebound after that. So what are these former scouts and their families and the pensions that they receive and the homesteads that they're awarded? How do these benefit the communities? How do they help build communities during this time of, this time of hardship, very difficult time. So that's what I'm looking at. The scouts after the Indian Wars, what happens to them after? I don't want to tell the Apache Wars story. I want to, or even the scout story in that setting. I want to tell it. They go back to their communities. What do? They're leaders. They're important. And maybe tying that to my previous work, these are individuals who've interacted with federal bureaucracy, with the army, with Indian agents and others. And so how do they use that knowledge to the benefit of their communities and in helping our community survive a really difficult period? So that's my next work.
That sounds great, Maurice. Well, thanks for taking some time to talk with us. Best of luck in all these future endeavors and in getting the word out about your book. These people have always been a republic. Thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.
Take care. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave a review on whatever app or platform you're using, or follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on Twitter at Writing West, where you can get updates and leave comments. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. Find him at Micah, D-A-H-L, Anderson with an O.com. I'll go ahead and put that link in the episode description if you didn't catch it. My name is Brendan Rensink. I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and just about everything else, so you can direct any praise or critiques my way. I'm Associate Director of the Redd Center and an Associate Professor of History at Brigham Young University. I'm author and editor of a number of books on the West, Borderlands, Native Peoples, Genocide Studies, Religion, and the Environment. You can find out more on my website, bwrensink, rensink.org, or follow me on Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. That's BrendenWRensink. One last plug, if you live in the Intermountain West, check out the Redd Center's digital public history project, Intermountain Histories, by visiting intermountainhistories.org, or by downloading the free mobile app by searching for Intermountain Histories on your Apple or Android devices. With this website and mobile app, you can read carefully curated about, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. Well, until next month, Be well, be curious, be kind.